The morning fog was thick over the fields. Birds hadn't even begun their songs. But Thomas, a quiet farmer in his early 60s, was already out by the fence, inspecting a broken wire near the back pasture. He'd lived alone on this land for nearly 20 years. No wife, no kids, just crops, soil, and silence. The nearest military base sat a few miles west, often sending distant echoes of choppers and drills into his sky. But Thomas never paid much attention. That world wasn't his, or so he thought. Then he heard it. A soft whimper. Broken. Weak. He froze. It came again. Sound of pain not from a person, but from something small. He stepped off the dirt path, boots sinking into wet grass, and moved slowly toward the edge of the woods. His eyes scanned the tree line until he saw it. A dog, lying still, covered in mud and something darker blood. Its fur was matted, torn in places, and its eyes. They weren't wild like most strays. They were trained, alert, but exhausted, as if it had been running from something for miles. But the strangest part, it wore a collar, not an ordinary one. A military-grade tracker, with a tag labeled K909. Thomas crouched, careful not to startle it. "Easy now," he whispered. "I'm not going to hurt you." He removed his jacket, wrapped the dog gently, and carried it back to the farmhouse. His hands trembled not from fear, but from something he couldn't name. A feeling in his gut that this wasn't just a wounded animal. Something about the dog's eyes, they were too human. Like it had seen things that didn't belong in these woods. Cleaned the wounds as best as he could, using old towels and antiseptic from his storm kit. The dog didn't resist. It simply watched him, quiet, obedient, and deeply sad. As Thomas wiped the blood from its side, he noticed a faint tattoo under its fur. A string of numbers. And a name he didn't expect. Rico. It wasn't just any name, it was familiar. Years ago, Thomas had read about a military K9 unit that went missing during a classified op overseas. The name Rico had been in that article. He remembered because the story ended mysteriously. The team vanished. No bodies, no gear, only silence. Now this dog, this Rico, was bleeding on his kitchen floor. Thomas sat back in his chair, staring at the animal. "What happened to you?" he whispered. The dog blinked slowly, as if trying to remember. But it wasn't done surprising him. Later that night, after the storm rolled in, Thomas heard movement on his porch. He stepped outside expecting wind damage or maybe a raccoon. But what he found chilled him to the bone. A man in military fatigues, face bruised and eyes wild, was slumped against the railing, his lips cracked, whispering something barely audible. "The dog, he's the last one. Don't let them take him." Before Thomas could react, the man collapsed. With 2 lives suddenly in his hands, one human, one barely clinging to life, Thomas had no idea what he'd just stepped into. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a dog anymore. Rain slammed hard against the farmhouse roof. Thomas dragged the unconscious soldier inside, water pooling behind them. His breath was shallow. His uniform soaked, torn, and bloodstained, had no name tag, only a patch on the sleeve. Unit Echo. The farmer laid him next to the fireplace, covered him with a thick quilt, and turned toward the dog still breathing, but barely. The two looked like they had come from the same nightmare. Thomas lit a fire, his hands shaking. He had no medical training. Just basic instincts and the quiet strength of a man who had survived more storms than he could count. But this storm was different. An hour passed. Then the man stirred. Eyes open, sharp and alert like a soldier waking up on instinct. Thomas crouched beside him. "You're safe here," he said gently. "You're on my farm. I found you on the porch." The soldier blinked, trying to speak. His voice was dry and hoarse. "Is Rico alive?" Thomas nodded toward the dog. The soldier let out a breath of relief, part pain, part peace. But then he grabbed Thomas's wrist with surprising strength. "They'll come looking. It's not just a dog." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "Who's they?" The soldier didn't answer. He passed out again. The next morning, Thomas stepped outside to clear his head. The rain had washed away the footprints, but not the unease in his chest. He walked to the fence line near the woods and noticed something odd. A strange glint near the tree roots. Something metallic. He knelt down and pulled it out. a broken radio. Military issue. Next to it, half buried in mud, was a torn piece of a patch with a symbol he didn't recognize, a red wolf's head over a triangle. He had never seen a patch like that before, and that meant one thing. Whoever the soldier was running from wasn't regular military. Back inside, Rico whimpered. Thomas turned sharply. The dog was now standing barely by the door, staring outside with intensity. "Easy now," Thomas said, walking closer. But Rico growled low in warning. He wasn't growling at Thomas. He was growling at the tree line. Someone was out there. Thomas grabbed his old hunting rifle, not fired in years, but still clean, and moved slowly to the window. 3 figures in black raincoats were walking along the edge of the woods. No lights, no talking, just scanning the field. One of them paused, pointed toward the house, then raised a hand signal. They weren't lost hikers, and they weren't friends. Thomas backed away from the window. He turned to the soldier, who was now awake, against wetting, eyes wide. "They're here," Thomas said. The soldier nodded. "You need to hide the dog. They get him. Everything we did was for nothing." Thomas frowned. "Why? What's so special about this dog?" The soldier looked him dead in the eye. "Because Rico doesn't just track enemies. He remembers them." Before Thomas could ask what that meant, the lights flickered, then cut out completely. Darkness filled the room. Only the fire glowed now. Rico stood, growling louder, his ears alert, body tense. Outside, the wind howled, and so did something else. Not human. Not dog. Something between. Thomas felt a chill crawl up his spine. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a trap he didn't know he'd walked into. And the thing they were after was already inside his home. The wind screamed outside, shaking the windows. Inside, Thomas moved fast. He grabbed an old oil lamp from the hallway and lit it with trembling hands. Shadows flickered across the walls. Rico stood like a statue near the door, growling deeper now. The soldier, still weak, tried to rise. Thomas said, gently pushing him back, "You're in no shape to fight, but I am." His voice was combat, his heart raced. He hadn't felt this alert in years. Something inside him had shifted the moment he saw those black-coated strangers outside. It wasn't fear, it was instinct, and something told him. This dog wasn't just cargo. Thomas moved Rico and the soldier to the barn behind the house. It was old but dry, and it had a hidden cellar beneath the hay bales where he used to store emergency supplies. "Stay here. Quiet," he whispered. Rico didn't bark, didn't move, just laid beside the soldier as if he knew what was coming. Thomas covered the trap door, spread hay over it, and stepped outside into the wind. Lightning flashed above the fields. Then he saw them. 3 figures. Closer now. They were crossing the field like they owned it, no hesitation, no sound. But Thomas noticed something strange. They didn't walk like regular men. Their movements were sharp, mechanical, almost trained to stalk. Thomas stepped out into the open, rifled over his shoulder, and shouted, "This is private land. You've got no right being here." One of the figures stopped. He pulled back his hood, his cold eyes, clean-shaven. No rain on his coat, like the storm avoided him. "We're tracking a military asset," the man said calmly. "A dangerous one." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "What kind of dog needs 3 men with silencers and night gear?" The man smiled. "It's not the dog that's dangerous. It's what he remembers." Thomas didn't move. "I haven't seen anything," he lied. "Just me and my chickens." Another figure stepped forward. A woman this time. She pulled out a photo from a waterproof pouch and showed it. It was Rico, and standing beside him was the same wounded soldier now hidden in Thomas's cellar. "You sure about that?" she asked, voice icy. Thomas stared at the photo. His throat tightened. He knew if he told the truth, they'd take Rico and leave nothing behind. He could see it in their eyes. He didn't know everything. But he knew this. That dog had earned something. And these people wanted to erase it. So he did something unexpected. He raised his rifle. Didn't point it, just held it strong, like a warning. "This is your last chance," he said. "Leave my land." The third figure stepped forward now. No face visible, just a black mask, and a long blade strapped to his leg. But the leader lifted a hand. "We're not here to make noise," he said quietly. Let's go. We'll be back before sunrise, and we won't knock. They turned, disappearing into the dark as quickly as they came. The soldier looked up, weak but awake. You didn't have to lie, he said. Thomas gave a small, tired smile. I didn't lie. I chose a side. The soldier nodded, and said something Thomas wasn't expecting. They weren't supposed to follow us here. But now that they have, you deserve to know the truth. Thomas leaned in, eyes sharp. What truth? The soldier whispered. Rico isn't just a tracker. He's the last witness to something they buried overseas. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. Before Thomas could speak, Rico stood up, ears locked forward, growling again. Not at the door this time, but at the floor beneath them. Rico's growl deepened. His body stood tense, nose pointing to the floor of the barn's cellar. Thomas froze, gripping the oil lamp tighter, while the soldier's pale face turned sharper, more alert than he had been all day. What's under us? Thomas whispered. The soldier's voice was low and serious. Not what. Who? Thomas dropped to one knee and tapped the wood floor near Rico. A hollow echo answered back. Then 3 quick knocks came from beneath. Knock, knock, knock. Not random. Signal. Thomas looked at the soldier. There's another one. Soldier didn't blink. There were 4 of us. 3 went down overseas. 1 never made it home until now. They lifted the trapdoor slowly. Beneath the stacked hay and dust-covered supplies was an old storm hatch. Thomas hadn't opened in over a decade. He turned the latch and opened it. A man lay there, half-conscious, wrapped in a shredded emergency blanket. His clothes were torn, soaked in dried blood, but his wrist wore the same military band as the soldier upstairs, Unit Echo. The man opened his eyes briefly, locked onto the other soldier, and whispered, Is Rico safe? That was the first thing he asked. Not about himself, not about home, not about help. Just about the dog. With both men now hidden deep within the barn, Thomas knew things were unraveling faster than he could handle.
Out.
2 wounded soldiers, 1 military dog, 3 strangers out in the woods, and a mystery none of them could explain, not fully. He stepped outside to breathe. The wind had quieted. The moon glowed through cracked clouds, but it wasn't peace he felt. It was the kind of calm you get right before something breaks. He turned Dan, stopped cold. Someone had left something in the dirt. A red triangle, drawn with chalk near his porch. At the center, a wolf's head, same as the torn patch he'd found earlier. They were marking the house. Back in the barn, the new soldier was waking up. His name was Ramirez. His voice was scratchy, but his mind was sharp. He explained what he could. 3 years ago, we were deployed to a site overseas, supposed to be an abandoned chemical weapons bunker, but it wasn't empty. He looked directly at Thomas. There were people in there, civilians, but they weren't, right? Like they'd been tested on. Thomas frowned. Tested. Ramirez nodded. Rico was trained to detect chemical threats. He barked before we even opened the gate. They didn't listen. The place blew massive gas leak. He paused, but Rico didn't forget. He remembers the scent. The other soldier added, That's why they want him. He can identify the scent of a weapon that officially doesn't exist. One that broke every treaty we ever signed. Thomas rubbed his face. It was too much. Too fast. They're trying to kill him to cover it up. Not just kill, Ramirez said. Erase his memory, his data, every trace of what he smelled. Thomas looked at Rico, who was now lying still, one paw twitching in sleep. Then why come here? He asked. Why not finish it on the battlefield? The room fell quiet. Then Ramirez said something that hit harder than any bullet. Because the people who made that gas weren't foreign. That's when it clicked. This wasn't about war. It was about something born inside their own walls. And Rico was the last one who could prove it ever existed. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch with his rifle, watching the tree line. No movement, no sound. Just the echo of everything he had learned. He glanced down at the drawing in the dirt, the triangle, and the wolf. They were still watching, still waiting. And he knew deep in his bones they wouldn't wait much longer. Suddenly, the barn light flickered. then cut out completely. A sharp yelp came from inside. Thomas ran, heart pounding, unaware of what he'd find. But whatever it was, had already entered. Thomas burst into the barn, shotgun raised, but it was silent. Too silent. The oil lamp had been knocked over. Its flame had gone out. The weak flashlight from Thomas's belt cast shaky shadows on the hay-covered floor. He swept it around, whispering, "Sharply, Rico." No bark. No footsteps. Only breathing, and not human. A deep, uneven breath came from the far corner. Thomas stepped closer, and froze. Rico was there, but something was wrong. His body was stiff, standing tall. His fur bristled. His eyes locked on Thomas. But they didn't look the same. They were glazed over, like he was seeing something not in the barn, but far away. The two soldiers were unconscious again. Ramirez was slumped against the wooden wall, and the other, the one who first appeared, was. On the ground, his arm twitching, Thomas knelt by them, shaking their shoulders. "What happened?" he hissed. "Who was here?" The first soldier blinked, barely able to focus. No one came in. Then he pointed weakly to Rico. He remembered something. Suddenly, Rico let out a short, sharp bark. Then another. He began pacing, walking, in a circle, nose to the ground. Then suddenly looking toward the barn's side wall, a spot no one had touched. Thomas followed the dog's gaze. There, hidden behind old barrels, was a piece of tarp nailed to the boards. He pulled it away, and behind it was something no one expected. A metal hatch, sunk halfway into the ground, camouflaged into the wall. Not a part of the barn's original structure. Its surface was marked with rust, something else, military stamps. 3 numbers. 0923 XE. "What is this?" Thomas muttered. The soldier struggled to sit up. "We didn't bring that," he whispered. "That's part of the old listening station." Thomas turned. "What station?" The soldier coughed. "Your farm. Used to be part of a Cold War outpost, hidden surveillance on the nearby base. They shut it down and covered it up, but something must have stayed behind." Thomas stared at the hatch. His land, his quiet, lonely land, was holding secrets no one ever told him about, and somehow Rico knew. Without waiting, the dog began pawing at the hatch. Thomas grabbed a crowbar from the workbench, jammed it under the rusted seam, and pulled with all his strength. The metal groaned. Dust exploded. Into the air, the hatch creaked open. A steel staircase led down into pure darkness. No smell. No sound, just a cold draft, and the feeling that something buried was about to surface. The two soldiers exchanged a look. One of them whispered, "That's where he smelled at last." Rico turned back to them, ears twitching, then dashed without. Waiting for permission, he descended into the dark. Thomas looked at the soldiers. "Can you move?" They both nodded, weakly. Then one of them said, "If he's going down there, we have to follow." They descended slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last. The air grew colder, and the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that screams inside your ears. At the bottom of the stairs was a concrete hallway, long and narrow. Pipes along the ceiling, flickering lights from broken fixtures, and at the end, a metal door, scratched, half open, and covered in black smudges. Thomas reached it first. He pushed the door wider slowly and stepped inside. The room looked like a lab, but everything was ruined. Tables overturned, documents soaked in mold, broken glass everywhere. And on the far wall, burned into the concrete, was a message written in black. "You never saw us."
Us!
Thomas stepped back. The soldiers looked, shaken, and Rico started barking uncontrollably. He stood at one particular spot on the floor right above a metal grate. Thomas knelt down and opened it. Inside was a sealed black case with a keypad, and next to it, a photo. It was a team photo. 4 soldiers, 2 scientists, and in the middle, Rico. But what shocked Thomas was the man standing in the back. It was the same man who had come to his porch wearing the black mask. "He was one of yours," Thomas whispered. The soldier nodded slowly. He didn't make it out. Thomas shook his head. Maybe he never left. Suddenly the lights cut out from the top of the stairwell. His footsteps echoed, not rushed, not clumsy, but steady, disciplined. They were no longer alone. The footsteps upstairs were slow, deliberate. Whoever had entered the barn wasn't in a rush. That made it worse. Thomas, the two soldiers, and Rico stood frozen in the cold lab, surrounded by the remains of a secret that had been buried for years. The black case in Thomas's hands was heavy, not just in weight, but in meaning. Inside it might be the reason all of this was happening. But before he could open it, one of the soldiers, Ramirez, staggered toward the far wall and wiped dust off an old filing cabinet. "I know this room," he muttered. Thomas turned. "You've been here before?" Ramirez's hands trembled as he pulled out a folder. "No, I've dreamed about it for 3 years." He opened the folder. Inside were photographs of Rico, training in desert fields, sniffing wires, chasing targets. Some showed soldiers. Some showed something else. Blurred faces, eyes glowing under infrared. And bodies. "Not quite right," Ramirez whispered. "They told us the lab was testing tracking techniques, scent recognition, canine memory, neural implants, but they lied." Thomas leaned closer. What were they really doing? The soldier beside him answered, voice hollow. "They were building dogs that don't forget." He looked at Rico, who was pacing now, tail low, whimpering. Not just trained, not just loyal, but haunted. Rico remembers everyone who ever harmed him. Every scent from that explosion, every scream, he remembers it all. Thomas blinked, struggling to take it in. Then why send him back here? The soldier's face darkened. Because they thought no one would find him. They dumped him near the base, wounded and alone. They thought the memory would fade. Thomas stared at Rico, who now stood over the case, paw pressed gently on the lid. But it didn't fade, Thomas said. It followed him. Ramirez opened the case. Inside was a flash drive, small and unmarked. It's next to a tan ID badge. Dr. L. Haskins' Neural Memory Research Division. Ramirez's eyes watered. She was one of the scientists. She didn't agree with what they were doing. The last time we saw her, she was sneaking Rico out during the gas explosion. We thought she died in the fire. Thomas looked at the badge again. Then to the back of the room, where a burnt lab coat still hung on the wall, untouched. Her name tag was there. Dr. Haskins had died in that room. But not before she hid the truth in the one creature they couldn't silence. Suddenly, above them, a thud echoed from the barn floor. Boots. More than one pair now. Ramirez looked toward the stairwell. "They're coming for the memory, not the dog." Thomas raised his rifle. "Then we give them neither." Rico barked again, louder, sharper. Then trotted toward the far side of the lab and pressed his head against a loose panel. Thomas walked over and pried it open. Inside, another tunnel. Dark, narrow, but just wide enough. He remembers the way out, Thomas said. The soldiers nodded. They had no time to argue. Ramirez grabbed the case. The other soldier helped Rico move. And they disappeared into the tunnel, leaving Thomas behind for one moment. He turned back to the message on the wall. "You never saw us." Then he whispered under his breath, "Maybe not, but I'm seeing you now." He dropped a flare into the lab, let it burn red, then ran into the tunnel, sealing the panel behind him. As they crawled through the passage, smoke began to rise behind them. Whatever proof was left in that lab, it was too dangerous to fall into the wrong hands. But the most important proof was limping beside them, still breathing, still remembering. After nearly 20 minutes, the tunnel opened into a broken well behind Thomas's cornfield. Climbed out, coughing, eyes wide at the fresh air. But Thomas noticed something. Rico was staring at the woods. Not afraid, but focused. The dog wasn't done yet. He remembered something else. And in the distance, deep in the trees, a small red light blinked, like an eye. Watching, waiting. The sun had just started rising when Thomas and the two wounded soldiers stepped out of the well. Rico limped beside them, head high, eyes locked on the woods. Behind them, smoke rose faintly from the hidden tunnel, swallowed by the morning fog. Thomas looked at his house across the field. Something felt off. Then he saw it. The front door was open. Someone had been inside. He raised his rifle as the group crept forward, but when they stepped through the doorway, Thomas's hands dropped. Because sitting at his kitchen table was a stranger, not in uniform, not armed, just calm, wearing a suit, and holding a badge. "Mr. Dalton," the man said quietly, "you've been harboring federal assets on private land? Right. We need to talk." Thomas didn't respond. The soldiers flanked him protectively. Rico stood between them all, growling low. The man stood up, hands raised. "I'm not part of the group chasing you. I'm with the Inspector General's office. Internal investigations." He placed a file on the table. "You've stumbled into something you weren't supposed to. But you're not the only one asking questions." Thomas slowly opened the file. Inside, photographs, lab photos, burnt bodies. Military documents marked Confidential Operation Red Hound, and at the bottom, a letter signed by Dr. Haskins, the man explained. Dr. Haskins made a report before the mission went dark. She sent it to a senator and to us. But it was intercepted buried until 2 months ago, when we recovered fragments of her final logs. He pointed to Rico. This dog wasn't just a tool. He was part of the evidence. The soldiers looked at each other in disbelief. "You knew all along?" Ramirez asked. "We suspected," the man said. "But with no bodies, no data, and no survivors willing to talk, we had nothing solid." He paused. "Until now." Thomas stared out the window. A black SUV had pulled up to the edge of his field. Then another. Not dark op vehicles. These looked official. Porters were getting out. One held a camera. Another had a microphone. Ramirez whispered, "Who called them?" The man in the suit answered, "I did." Within the hour, the front porch of Thomas's quiet farmhouse had become something else entirely. Flashbulbs, journalists, law enforcement. Military vehicles parked just beyond the cornfields, and at the center of it all was Rico. The story was too powerful to ignore. A dog trained to remember the unthinkable, soldiers discarded by a mission that didn't exist, a farmer who took them in without asking questions. The media ate it up, but something else began to happen too. People started listening. A neighbor brought food. A state trooper offered protection. A young boy came up and asked if he could pet Rico, who gently rested his head in the boy's lap. The shift was real. What had begun in shadows was now in the open. The same people who had once laughed off conspiracy now stood in silence, watching a broken dog lie at the feet of men who risked everything to protect the truth. A quiet respect spread through the crowd. No one said it, but you could feel it in the air. Rico wasn't just a dog anymore. The man in the suit leaned close to Thomas. "We'll have to move them soon. Witness protection, federal hearings. This isn't going to stay quiet." Thomas nodded, eyes still on Rico. "Good. Let it get loud." But even as reporters shouted questions, something pulled at the edge of Thomas's thoughts, at a blinking red light from the woods. He hadn't forgotten it. And neither had Rico. Later that night, long after the media left and the field returned to its quiet stillness, Thomas sat with the two soldiers on the porch. They talked softly about the past, about people lost, about regrets, and about Dr. Haskins. "She died trying to protect him," Ramirez said, nodding at Rico. "She believed memories could change the future. Not just for soldiers, but for everyone." Thomas looked down at the old wooden floor, worn smooth by time, and back up at the stars. Somewhere out there, people were scrambling, erasing, editing, spinning. But here on this porch, the truth had already started to grow roots. And Rico, he stared at the woods, still alert. The next morning came softly. Fog covered the fields like a blanket. No cameras, no trucks, no strangers this time, just stillness. Thomas stood at the edge of the porch, sipping hot coffee, staring out at the trees. Everything that had happened felt like a dream. But the burn marks near the barn, the black triangle still etched in the dirt, and the photo of Rico in the lab, those were real. And so was the weight in his chest. Behind him, Rico lay quietly by the door, head resting on his paws. He didn't growl, didn't bark. He just watched. Thomas had seen enough animals to know when they sensed something was coming. He stepped into the house where the two soldiers were packing what little they had. The federal agent had returned earlier that morning. It was time for them to disappear into a new life, into silence. "You sure this is what you want?" Thomas asked. Ramirez nodded. "We don't have a choice. Not if we want Rico to live," the agent added quietly. "We'll keep his file sealed, change the name, He'll never be traced. Thomas looked down at the dog. He's not just a file. The agent nodded, almost ashamed. We know that now. By midday, everything was ready. A plain van pulled up near the road. No logos, no noise. Ramirez shook Thomas's hand. You saved more than just a dog. The other soldiers saluted him without a word, but it was Rico who made the moment stop. As he stood to leave, he paused. He walked back to Thomas, tail low, and rested his head gently against the farmer's leg. Just for a moment, then turned and walked away. No barking, no whimper. Just that one final touch of silent trust. Thomas stood there long after the van disappeared into the trees. He didn't wave. He didn't cry. He just stood still like a soldier on guard. Later that evening, neighbors came by, people who had seen the news. Some brought food, some brought questions. Most brought only quiet support. No one laughed anymore. No one called him the weird old farmer, not after what they had seen. A girl from the next town over left a small card on his porch. On it, she'd drawn a picture of a dog with soldier's tags. Below it, she had written, "Some heroes walk on four legs." The next morning, Thomas visited town. He didn't speak to many people, but they nodded at him with respect. The same sheriff who once ignored his reports now stopped and offered a quiet handshake. "You did something brave," he said. "Don't think folks didn't notice." Thomas just nodded. "I didn't do it for people." The sheriff smiled. "I know. That's why it mattered." Back home, Thomas found something strange on his porch again. A small wooden box. No return address. Row markings. Inside was Rico's original collar. Attached was a tag, not with a number, not with a code. It's just a name. Rico, he never forgot. There was no letter, no explanation, but Thomas understood. It wasn't about owning him. It was about remembering him. That evening, as the sky turned gold, Thomas walked the field one last time. At the far edge near the trees, he placed the collar on an old wooden post and tied a red ribbon around it. No plaque, no words. Just a quiet marker for something too powerful to explain. Then he stepped back and whispered the only words that felt right. "Good boy." He stood in the fading light, the wind brushing past, carrying the scent of smoke and grass and memory. And in that silence, no applause. No headlines, just the truth. A wounded dog remembered what others tried to erase, and a quiet farmer made sure the world wouldn't forget. Months passed. The fields turned golden with the change of seasons. Leaves danced through the air, and the sound of distant harvest tractors echoed softly through the valley. Life had returned to its rhythm, but for Thomas, something had changed forever. He still woke before sunrise, still fixed fences, still fed the chickens. But every now and then he'd stop mid-step, mid-task and look toward the trees, half expecting to see a flash of fur, familiar shape. A pair of eyes that had once told an entire story without saying a word. But Rico never came back, and Thomas never forgot. The collar stayed on the wooden post near the edge of the cornfield. It weathered the wind, the rain, even a late summer storm that uprooted trees, but not that post. Some neighbors came to see it. One of them, a teacher from the nearby middle school, stood quietly by the marker and took a photo. A week later, Thomas received a letter in the mail. It was from a group of 7th graders who had read about Rico's story during a special lesson on loyalty, memory, and silent courage. They called the dog the hero who remembered. A few days after that, a small bronze plaque arrived in a package. Thomas hadn't ordered it. No return address again. Simply read, "In honor of Rico." The dog who remembered what the world tried to forget. Thomas placed it beneath the collar on the post. He didn't need attention. He didn't want crowds. But he knew some stories needed a place to rest. Even if the world moved on, memory shouldn't. Later that winter, a book was published by an anonymous source. Its title, Echoes in the Smoke, What One Dog Saw. Inside were accounts of the secret unit, redacted mission notes, and the final letters of Dr. Haskins. The story spread quietly first among veterans, then journalists, then historians. It caused ripples in Washington. The hearings were closed to the public, but someone inside leaked one moment that would never be forgotten. A single photo shown on a projector. It was of Rico, sitting beside a soldier's boot, surrounded by ash. The last one left. Senator reportedly stood up after seeing it and said, "We trained him to remember our enemies, but in the end, he remembered us." Thomas never bragged. He never claimed to be part of history. But one spring afternoon, a black SUV pulled into his driveway. A woman stepped out, holding the leash of a new service dog, young, alert, full of life. She approached quietly and handed him a folder. Inside were photos, a new team. K-9 units trained in memory recall, not just scent. Their methods, their ethics, all based on what Rico had endured and survived. Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. The woman said softly, "They're calling it the Rico Protocol." He nodded, not trusting his voice, then looked at the collar still resting on the post, still strong, still waiting. That evening, as the stars returned to the sky, Thomas sat on the porch, rocking gently in his chair. The fields were quiet, peaceful, but in his mind he saw them all again. Ramirez, the soldier who couldn't speak at first, Dr. Haskins, hiding the flash drive with shaking hands, and Rico head low, tail still, ears sharp. The soldier, the witness, the friend. Thomas leaned back, closed his eyes, and smiled, because he knew what most people never do, that the greatest stories aren't loud. They're loyal, and they live on in silence. And somewhere deep in the woods, a red light blinked off, as if to say, "We remember too."